It is the mid-19th century in rural Ireland. The land is green and fertile in appearance, but millions of Irish families live on the edge of subsistence. In small thatched cottages, tenant farmers and laborers rely almost entirely on one crop, the potato, for their daily meals. Potatoes are hardy and nutritious, yielding abundant food even on tiny plots. By the 1840s, nearly half of Ireland's 8 million people depend on potatoes as their primary food source. On an average day, a laborer's family might consume 8 to 14 pounds of potatoes per person. Boiled or baked, often supplemented only by a little buttermilk or salt, this heavy reliance on a single crop makes the population highly vulnerable to any failure of the potato. Social and economic conditions compound this fragility. Most Irish farmers do not own their land. They rent small parcels from landlords. Under a tenuous system, land has been subdivided into ever smaller plots to accommodate growing families, leaving many tenants with just an acre or two to cultivate. In the mountainous west and the rural south, Irish-speaking communities live in extreme poverty, paying rents from their meager harvests. Rural laborers known as cottiers might work a landlord's fields and in exchange be allowed a patch of ground for their own potatoes. For these families, the potato is quite literally life. A good potato yield means survival through the winter. A bad yield could mean hunger and hardship. Yet, in the 1840s, Ireland is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and despite local poverty, vast amounts of food are exported from Ireland to the industrial cities of Britain each year. Paradoxically, Ireland produces plenty of food, but much of it is shipped abroad for profit. The Irish poor largely cannot afford these exports and remain dependent on their own potato crop. Politically, Ireland's fate lies in the hands of the British government at Westminster. Irish Catholics finally won emancipation and the right to vote a generation earlier, led by Daniel O'Connell, but they still suffer legal and social inequalities. Many in London regard Ireland's problems with a mix of indifference and prejudice. There is a widespread belief in laissez-faire economics. The government should not interfere with trade or provide too much aid, lest it encourage dependency. This mindset will color the official response to the coming catastrophe. In 1845, the British Prime Minister is Sir Robert Peel, a conservative reformer who has shown some sympathy to Ireland's situation. In Ireland itself, local poor law unions operate grim workhouses for destitute paupers, institutions so dreaded that people only enter them as a last resort. Conditions in the workhouses are purposefully harsh. Families are separated by gender, given meager rations, and forced into hard labor, all to deter what British policymakers call idleness. Still, by 1845, despite chronic poverty, Ireland's population has reached about 8.4 million, the highest it has ever been. Generations have grown up healthy on the potato diet, but this delicate balance is about to be shattered by a mysterious blight and a tragically inadequate response. The stage is set for an immense calamity that Irish people will remember as in Gortamore, the Great Hunger, or simply, the Great Irish Famine. Late summer, 1845. Across the Irish countryside, farmers watch with alarm as their potato plants exhibit strange signs of disease. Leaves are turning black, withering seemingly overnight, and when peasants dig into their potato mounds, many tubers are found rotten and foul-smelling. On September 13, 1845, the Gardener's Chronicle in Britain reports that a potato rot has struck Dublin's environs and asks the ominous question: where will Ireland be in the event of a universal potato rot? This is the first official report of the potato blight in Ireland, a fungal disease that had already ravaged potato crops in North America and parts of Europe in the preceding years. The spores of this blight likely arrived by ship from the New World, thriving in Ireland's unusually cool wet weather that year. Potato plants blacken in the fields, and a substantial portion of the 1845 crop is ruined. For Ireland's poorest, this news is cause for dread. However, the full extent of the loss in 1845 is not total. Estimates later suggest perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the potato crop is destroyed that year. Many families still manage to gather some potatoes from unblighted parts of their fields. Moreover, other foods exist: livestock, grains, vegetables, but these are cash crops, or too expensive for the rural poor. as reports of the blight spread. The British government under Prime Minister Peel remains cautiously optimistic, hoping the damage will be limited. Peel secretly arranges an emergency measure. Using government funds, purchases £100,000 worth of Indian corn from America to be shipped to Ireland. By importing this inexpensive grain and selling it at cost in depots, Peel aims to keep food prices down and avert panic. This Indian corn begins arriving in early 1846. It is unfamiliar to the Irish diet and difficult to mill or cook, but it will prove a lifesaver for some. Peel also authorizes a relief commission to coordinate charitable donations and modest public works to provide employment. Meanwhile, local committees raise funds and distribute what food they can. In November 1845, scientific commissioners report to Peel that perhaps half of Ireland's potato crop has been lost. Winter is coming, and the specter of hunger looms, but outright famine is not yet inevitable. Many families survive the winter of 1845 to 46 by stretching their remaining potatoes, borrowing food, or buying Indian cornmeal from Peel's depots. There are hungry households, to be sure, but no mass starvation in this first year. The relief efforts of 1845 to 46, though limited, are relatively successful in staving off disaster. Politically, the crisis of 1845 also triggers a debate in London. Peel decides that the long-standing corn laws must be repealed to allow cheaper grain into Ireland and Britain. In early 1846, Peel pushes for repeal of these protectionist laws, arguing that free trade in grain will help feed the masses during the potato failure. This move is deeply controversial and splits his Conservative Party. Nonetheless, by June 1846, the corn laws are repealed, removing tariffs on grain. Ironically, this policy change does little to immediately relieve Irish peasants. Cornmeal and bread may become cheaper for some, but without income or potatoes, many Irish still cannot afford food at any price. However, Peel's action has significant political consequences. His own party turns against him over the corn law issue. In June 1846, Peel's government falls, and he resigns as Prime Minister. A new administration takes over just as Ireland is sliding toward a deeper tragedy. The incoming Prime Minister is Lord John Russell, leading a Whig government that will soon be tested by the escalating famine. Spring and summer 1846 bring dread and devastation. Irish farmers, hoping the previous year's blight was a one-time blow, plant their potatoes as usual in the spring. Many have been forced to cut their seed stock to a minimum. Some even plant the few rotten potatoes they salvaged, praying for a healthy crop. As the months go by, it becomes apparent that the blight is not gone. In midsummer, once again, potato plants across Ireland begin to wither almost overnight, leaves curling and blackening as the airborne fungus strikes again. This time, the destruction is even more widespread. Whole districts see their potato fields turn to slime. By the end of the 1846 harvest season, it is clear that the potato crop has failed catastrophically, far worse than in 1845. Some estimates suggest that 3/4 or more of the 1846 potato harvest is lost to blight. Unlike the year before, this time there are no reserves to fall back on. The people had consumed or sold whatever surplus they had during the previous winter. Now, as autumn 1846 arrives, an ominous silence and despair fall over the countryside. The Great Famine has truly begun. The new Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, and his chief economic advisor, Charles Trevelyan, respond with policies guided by a strict ideology. They believe fervently in the principles of laissez-faire and self-reliance. While they acknowledge the crisis, they are determined that Irish poverty not become a permanent burden on British taxpayers. Trevelyan, a senior Treasury official now effectively in charge of famine relief, is wary of doing too much for the Irish. He fears that giving out free food or charity will make the population dependent on government aid. Instead, the Russell government's relief strategy in late 1846 is to expand public works projects. Able-bodied Irish men in distressed areas can be given jobs building roads, digging ditches, or breaking stones, and in return earn wages to buy food. In theory, this lets people earn their keep and avoids simply handing out food. In practice, however, by late 1846 the situation is so dire that many workers are already weak from hunger and disease, barely able to perform heavy labor. Moreover, food prices continue to rise beyond the reach of the poor. As the blight-decimated potatoes become scarce, market prices for other staples remain high, partly because merchants continue to export large quantities of Irish food overseas. Indeed, throughout the famine, substantial food exports from Ireland to Great Britain persist. In one of history's cruel ironies, Ireland in 1846 is exporting grain, dairy and meat to England, while its own people starve. The British government refuses to ban exports or requisition food for local relief, adhering to free trade principles. To many observers, this policy is grievously misguided. Later, Irish nationalist John Mitchell would famously charge, "The Almighty, indeed, sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine," a reference to how British policies exacerbated the crisis. By late 1846, the effects of starvation are becoming widespread. With the potato gone, impoverished families survive on what they can scrape together, perhaps turnips, wild greens, berries, or small game. Some resort to eating nettles, docks, even grass. Others boil thin gruel from Indian cornmeal if they can get it. As their sustenance dwindles, people grow emaciated and weak. Diseases begin to spread among the undernourished. Famine, fever, dysentery, and diarrhea ravage weakened bodies. In remote villages, local priests and officials send pleas for help, describing horrific scenes. One such account comes from Skibbereen in County Cork, which will become notorious as one of the hardest-hit areas. In December 1846, Nicholas Cummins, a justice of the peace, travels to Skibbereen to see conditions firsthand. He writes a letter to the Duke of Wellington detailing what he saw. Whole villages silent and apparently deserted. Houses filled with ghastly skeletons of people in the final stages of starvation. Cummins describes entering one cabin to find 6 wretched figures huddled in the corner, famished and ghastly, lying among filthy straw. A mother, children, and what had been a man, all barely alive and delirious with fever. In another hut, he is grabbed by a crazed woman clutching her dead infant, the woman's body covered only in a tattered sack. Corpses lie unburied in some dwellings, as there is no strength or will left to enter the dead. Cummins concludes that no words could adequately convey the horror. These frightful specters of hunger he encountered were beyond imagination. Such accounts shock readers in Britain and elsewhere, but still effective relief is slow to arrive. Through the bitter winter of 1846–47, conditions deteriorate further. The Public Works Program, which at its peak employs some 700,000 Irish laborers on projects, proves unable to keep pace with the escalating misery. Laborers on the works are paid wages, but often wages are delayed or insufficient. And local prices for food soar so high that a day's pay can barely buy a few handfuls of meal. The work itself, breaking stones or building roads to nowhere, consumes the last calories of starving men. Many collapse at the work sites or fall ill and die shortly after. The Illustrated London News reports on scenes of workers dropping from exhaustion on road projects. Meanwhile, the Irish countryside becomes a landscape of despair. Along roads and ditches, witnesses see women and children wandering in rags, begging for anything to eat. Entire families evicted from their cottages for non-payment of rent roam homeless. Evictions indeed are mounting. Landlords themselves, pressed by debts, and now responsible for paying poor rates, choose to expel penniless tenants rather than support them. One contemporary observer notes that the crowbar brigade teams of landlord agents with crowbars would arrive to tear down the roofs of cottages, expelling starving families into the cold. These evictions often target the most vulnerable: widows, the sick, and those unable to work. In many cases, landlords believe clearing the poor off the land is the only way to avoid bankruptcy, especially after a new policy shifts relief costs onto property owners. Later, in 1847, Parliament will pass a law making Irish landlords financially responsible for famine relief, which only encourages more evictions. By early 1847, tens of thousands of rural poor have been turned out of their homes. Some crowd into workhouses. Others build makeshift shelters of sticks and mud along the roadsides, or huddle in abandoned buildings. The lucky might find space with a neighbor or relative. The unlucky succumb on the fields and roadways, Small farmers, who once prided themselves on self-sufficiency, are reduced to begging at their neighbors' doors or joining food riots when supply depots run out of corn. In these dark months, the death toll climbs not just from starvation but overwhelmingly from disease. Typhus, a louse-borne fever, thrives in the conditions of famine, weakened immune systems, crowded dwellings, and poor sanitation. Famine fever spreads through villages and even jumps to the towns. Relief workers, clergy, and doctors often fall ill themselves. In 1847, an estimated typhus epidemic would kill thousands, including some of those trying to help. Priests administering last rites, doctors treating the poor, and members of relief committees. Despite this, the British government under Russell and Trevelyan remains committed to a minimalist approach as 1846 turns to 1847. Trevelyan, in particular, sees a providential purpose in the famine. In private correspondence and writings, he expresses a harsh view. The famine, he believes, is a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, a divine chastisement meant to correct the social evils of Ireland. He describes the disaster as the sharp but effectual remedy by which the cure is likely to be effected. In other words, Trevelyan feels the famine is teaching the Irish a moral lesson and forcing much-needed change in land and society. This almost cruel optimism means Trevelyan is in no rush to halt what he sees as a natural corrective. He therefore limits government aid, believing market forces and charitable works should suffice. Such attitudes at the highest levels of authority translate into policies that fall far short of the need. The year 1847 will be remembered in Ireland as Black 47, the absolute nadir of the Great Famine. By the start of 1847, the countryside is in chaos. Thousands dying each week, countless more hovering on the brink. The potato crop has failed 2 years in a row, and there is every indication that blight may strike yet again. The British government, alarmed by the spiraling death toll and the inadequacy of the public works program, makes a significant change in policy. In the spring of 1847, Parliament passes the Temporary Relief Act, more commonly known as the Soup Kitchen Act. This new approach recognizes that many people are too weak to work and need food immediately. The idea is to provide free soup to the starving through a network of soup kitchens until the next harvest. By summer 1847, soup kitchens spring up all over Ireland, run by government relief, local committees, and charitable organizations. At their peak, approximately 3 million people are being fed daily in 1,850 soup kitchens across the country. This is an enormous undertaking in a country of 8 million. In some towns, long lines of spectral figures queue up with bowls or pots to receive a ladle of nutritious soup. The soup recipes vary, but a typical one might include oats or Indian meal boiled with vegetables and a little meat or fat for flavor. Alex Sawyer, a famous French chef, even comes to Dublin to help design efficient soup kitchens that can serve thousands. Reports suggest that in Dublin's model kitchen, 5,000 people a day were fed at the height of the effort. For a brief period in mid-1847, the soup kitchens markedly reduced the mortality rate. People finally receive sustenance without the hurdle of wages or work. Many lives are saved as the free food flows. However, the scheme is always meant to be temporary. The British Treasury is reluctant to continue free distribution for long, and Trevelyan in particular worries that the Irish might become habitually dependent on government handouts. Thus, in August 1847, as the new harvest season arrives, the soup kitchens are systematically shut down. Responsibility for feeding the poor is shifted entirely to the Irish, local authorities under a new law, the Irish Poor Law Extension Act of 1847. This law makes Irish landlords and poor law unions responsible for famine relief, rather than the central British government. In theory, each local region must support its own poor through the poor rate. In practice, this move places a crushing burden on many localities that are already devastated. Many landlords, faced with skyrocketing poor rates, see only one solution: evict their destitute tenants to reduce the number of people needing relief on their lands. In the wake of the soup kitchen period, a new wave of evictions unfolds. British parliamentarian William Gregory even adds a clause to the poor law: any tenant holding more than a quarter acre of land is ineligible for relief. This forces smallholders to surrender their tiny farms if they seek food in a workhouse. As a result, countless more small farmers give up their land or are evicted, contributing to the mass clearance of the rural population. Roofs are removed from cottages to prevent return, and entire villages are razed by landlord agents in some cases. Amid these changes, Black 47 witnesses death on an unprecedented scale. Although the potato blight actually abated somewhat in 1847, the people had been so impoverished that famine deepened regardless. Starvation and disease struck hardest in 1847. Mass graves became common. As the dead were too numerous and too poor for proper funerals, in some areas, bodies were buried in shallow pits with no coffins, leading to the term coffinless ships for the carts carrying corpses. Workhouses, the last refuge for the destitute, overflowed beyond capacity. Originally built to hold perhaps 100,000 inmates nationwide, by late 1847, the workhouses and their auxiliary fever hospitals are swamped with many times that number. Families desperate for shelter crowd at the doors. Inside, the conditions are appalling. Fever runs rampant in the confined quarters, and mortality is shockingly high. Inmates already weak die in droves. Surviving records from some workhouses indicate that in 1847 alone, a significant fraction of all inmates died of disease or malnutrition. One official described the situation in a Mayo workhouse. The dead were buried without coffins. We had not the means to procure them. Fever patients lay on straw on the floor, with scarcely any attendance. The workhouse system, intended as a deterrent to idleness, becomes a death trap for many during the famine's height. As one historical account puts it, these workhouses were the most feared and hated institutions in Ireland, yet so many people had no choice but to seek shelter there. Throughout Black 47, emigration explodes as a survival strategy. Those who can afford passage, or who are assisted by landlords or relatives, increasingly choose to leave Ireland entirely. Harbors are crowded with emigrants bidding tearful farewells. In the spring of 1847, ports like Liverpool and Cork and Belfast are thronged with ragged families boarding emigrant ships. Many landlords, hoping to reduce the number of destitute on their lands, offer its tenants passage money to North America. Some see this as compassionate. Others dub it assisted emigration. Essentially, landlords paying to expel the poor. Tragically, the year 1847 is also known for the horrors of the coffin ships. These were the overcrowded, often barely seaworthy vessels that carried Irish emigrants across the Atlantic. Driven by desperation, over 100,000 Irish sailed for Canada in 1847 alone. Passage to Canada was cheaper than to the United States. So many poor Irish took that route. The journey was cruelly mismanaged. Overcrowded, poorly provisioned ships became breeding grounds for disease. Weak and malnourished passengers, confined in filthy holds, succumbed to typhus and dysentery during the voyage. It is estimated that of those who left for Canada in 1847, 1 out of every 5 died either at sea or shortly after landing. Grass Isle, the quarantine station in the St. Lawrence River near Quebec, saw over 5,000 Irish men, women, and children die in 1847 alone. Medical tents overflowed with the sick. Priests performed last rites in mass on the docks. Similar tragedies played out in other Canadian ports, and in the United States as well. The term coffin ship was grimly apt. The vessels became floating coffins for many. Those who survived the journey often arrived orphans or widows, having lost family members en route. Still, despite the dangers, emigration was a lifeline for countless Irish. Remittances would eventually help sustain those left behind. By the end of 1847, the Irish exodus is well underway. Families scattered, population dwindling, the social fabric of Ireland forever altered. 1847 also sees the passing of some notable figures. In Dublin, the great Irish statesman Daniel O'Connell, now aged and ailing, uses his last energies to plead for his people. In February 1847, O'Connell rises in the British House of Commons and implores Parliament to relieve the starving Irish, to save a nation from perishing, urging them to act with compassion. His words fall largely on deaf ears. Worn down by years of struggle and the heartbreak of the famine, O'Connell leaves Ireland to seek health in the continent, dies in Genoa in May 1847. His death marks the end of an era, the loss of the most prominent voice for peaceful change just when Ireland is in greatest agony. Another figure, perhaps unexpected, who draws attention is the monarch herself, Queen Victoria. In 1847, the Queen is perceived as having done little to alleviate the famine. She privately donated £2,000 to an English relief fund. By the end of 1847, the worst of the famine's starvation phase has peaked. Yet there is little cause for rejoicing. Perhaps 1 million people are already dead or dying. The countryside is littered with the ruins of cottages and the bones of those who could not escape. Ireland's population has plummeted. One government official assessing the situation that winter grimly notes entire districts nearly depopulated. And still, the blight has not entirely gone. The potato disease would return in the coming year. The question on everyone's mind: when will this nightmare end? The famine does not simply end with the turning of a calendar page. 1848 brings a third consecutive year of despair for many parts of Ireland. The potato blight returns again in 1848, though more sporadically. In some regions, farmers brave enough to plant potatoes do see a partial harvest. In other regions, another ruined crop. The Irish people, now physically and emotionally drained, trudge on as best they can. Death and disease continue to claim lives in large numbers through 1848 and 1849. A major cholera epidemic sweeps through Ireland in 1849, part of a global cholera pandemic hitting the weakened population hard. In crowded workhouses and slums, cholera finds easy victims among those already susceptible due to hunger. British government policy after 1847 remains largely hands-off. With the poor law system theoretically in charge, Charles Trevelyan in London believes the worst is over by 1848 and even closes down the government's Central Relief Commission. Yet in remote villages in counties like Mayo, Donegal, and Clare, people are still dying of famine in 1848 and 1849. Local poor law boards struggle to cope. Many poor law unions go bankrupt, unable to collect enough in-rates from landlords. When a poor law union ran out of funds, its workhouse could no longer buy food or fuel, leading to sometimes horrifying situations where inmates were reduced to near starvation inside the workhouse. Some unions had to consolidate or were taken over by neighboring ones to keep relief going. Evictions continue unabated. 1848 to 49 are peak years for evictions as landlords attempt to clear their lands of tenants who are a financial burden. Hundreds of thousands of people in total would be evicted during the famine years. There are scenes of mass clearances. For instance, an observer might witness dozens of mud cabins being leveled in a single day by eviction crews. The former occupants left by the roadside. The tragedy of Bridget O'Donnell, an impoverished woman from County Clare, illustrates the human toll of these evictions. Bridget's story, published in the Illustrated London News in late 1849, gave a face to the suffering. She and her family had once held a few acres of land in a small cottage. After falling behind on rent, Bridget's family was evicted in November 1848. At the time, Bridget was pregnant and also ill with fever. She later recounted how the landlord's agent, accompanied by men wielding crowbars, came to demolish her home while she lay inside sick. They commenced knocking down the house, and had half of it knocked down, Bridget recalled, until neighbors carried her out in a semi-conscious state. She gave birth prematurely in a makeshift shelter shortly after. The baby was born dead. One of her other children, a 13-year-old son, also died of fever and hunger while the family was struggling after the eviction. The grain they had grown was seized by the landlord's agents to cover debts, leaving Bridget not a bit for my children to eat. Bridget O'Donnell's gaunt image with her 2 children, sketched by artist James Mahoney, became an icon of the famine's cruelty. Her story is just one among thousands. Every parish had similar tales of heartbreak, children orphaned, families torn apart, pregnant women and the elderly thrown out of their homes in the midst of winter. Amid the despair of 1848, there is also a flicker of resistance. A group of young Irish nationalists, known as the Young Irelanders, had grown increasingly angry at British misrule and the suffering of their people. Led by men like William Smith O'Brien, John Mitchell, and Thomas Marr, they planned to ignite a rebellion against British authority. The timing coincided with revolutionary fervor sweeping Europe in 1848. However, The attempted Young Ireland Rebellion of July 1848 was small and poorly organized. The planned nationwide uprising fizzled into a single skirmish in a County Tipperary village, where starving peasants armed with pitchforks and a few guns confronted police. It was quickly suppressed. O'Brien and other leaders were arrested. John Mitchell had already been arrested earlier and transported to Bermuda for his fiery writings. Mitchell's newspaper had decried the famine as deliberate genocide, as noted earlier. The failure of this rebellion showed that the Irish were often too weakened and scattered to mount organized resistance. Nonetheless, it was a sign that resentment was boiling. The famine had shaken trust in British governance to the core. One British observer in 1848 commented that Ireland is a powder magazine and famine has been the fuse. While a full-scale revolt did not happen during the famine, the legacy of hatred and distrust would later fuel movements for Irish independence. By 1849 and 1850, the potato blight still appeared but less uniformly. Some harvests recovered. In 1849, another partial failure in certain areas caused localized famine conditions yet again. But slowly, year by year, the situation in aggregate began to improve. The population base was lower, which meant slightly less pressure on food resources. Some people adjusted by diversifying their plantings. Those who had a bit of land might plant other crops like oats, carrots, or turnips instead of solely potatoes, if they could get seeds. Relief efforts continued in reduced form. Workhouses remained operative in some outdoor relief, begrudgingly provided by poor law guardians in extreme cases. Private charity also persisted. For example, the Society of Friends, who had been active since 1846, continued to operate relief programs. One noteworthy event in 1849 was the visit of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to Ireland. The royal visit in August 1849 was strategically timed after the worst of the famine in the eastern regions had subsided. During her tour, which mostly stuck to Dublin and estates in the east, Queen Victoria was greeted by cheering crowds. For many, the visit was a welcome distraction, an assertion that Ireland was still valued by the crown. However, critics noted that the Queen did not venture into the devastated western counties or truly see the famine's impact. Her visit did little to change policy or relieve suffering, but it did help improve the monarchy's public image briefly. In reality, by 1849, the famine was still raging in pockets, especially in the far west, where blight-afflicted potato crops and cholera combined to wreak havoc. A poignant example: in 1849, people in parts of County Mayo were still dying of famine, at such a rate that the workhouse in Swinford had to bury hundreds in mass graves, and local landlords reported entire villages emptying out due to death or emigration. Throughout 1848 to 1850, emigration remains an enormous factor. Having seen the worst at home, those who survived often decided their future lay elsewhere. The exodus that began in Black 47 continued for the rest of the century, but these years immediately after were the most intense. By 1855, at least 2.1 million people had left Ireland since the start of the blight. Many departed during 1848 to 1850, going to not only North America but also to England and Scotland. While conditions on emigrant ships gradually improved from the horrors of 1847, due to stricter passenger acts and better regulation, the sheer loss of population was staggering. The 1851 census of Ireland revealed the outcome starkly. In 1841, Ireland's population was 8.175 million. In 1851, it was 6.552 million, a drop of over 1.6 million people in a decade. Statisticians estimated that about 1 million had died from 1845 to 1851, and another million or more had emigrated. In some of the hardest-hit counties, populations fell by 30%, 40%, even 50% or more. For example, County Clare's population plummeted. Small towns that once bustled were now half empty. Western regions that were predominantly Irish-speaking were particularly decimated, contributing to a steep decline in the Irish language in those areas. The famine, in effect, marked the end of an era. The old rural Gaelic Ireland of numerous small farmers and laborers living off potatoes would never return. By 1852, the Great Irish Famine is generally considered to have drawn to a close. The potato blight itself receded. From 1850 onward, potato yields gradually improved, and alternate food sources were found. Normal weather cycles resumed, and the economy began a slow recovery, but Ireland was forever changed. The immediate effect was a sharply reduced population. Between death and emigration, the island lost roughly a quarter of its people in just a few years. Those who survived were often scarred by trauma, loss, and the memory of hunger. Many families had lost multiple members. Some communities had effectively vanished. The demographic freefall did not stop in 1852 either. Emigration continued at a high rate in the 1850s and beyond, fueled both by lingering economic hardship and the chain migration of relatives joining those already abroad. By 1871, Ireland's population was down to about 5.4 million. And by 1901, just 4.4 million, roughly half of what it had been on the eve of the famine. Ireland would not reach its pre-famine population again, even in the 21st century. The famine's economic and social impact was also profound. The structure of Irish agrarian society changed, with so many small tenants gone. Some landlords consolidated holdings and shifted agriculture from tillage to pasturage, which required fewer laborers. The Encumbered Estates Act of 1849 allowed bankrupt landlords to sell off their lands. Many English investors bought these estates, leading to changes in land ownership. Surviving farmers increasingly adopted a mentality of avoiding over-reliance on the potato. Diversification and a desire for more secure tenure eventually led to land reforms later in the 19th century. But in the short term after the famine, Irish rural life was subdued and saddened. Observers noted a stark change in the people, a silence where once there was music and laughter, a resignation where once there had been lively community gatherings. The traditional Irish social fabric, vibrant with dances, fairs, and communal work, had been torn apart by years of death and dispersal. Culturally, the Great Hunger left deep marks. Irish folklore and songs recall the years of Angorda Moor with sorrow and anger. Stories passed down speak of hungry grass, and recollect the kindness of those who helped versus the cruelty of those who did not. The Irish language saw a steep decline, as mentioned, because many of the areas hit hardest were predominantly Irish-speaking. Survivors in some cases switched to English, seeking new opportunities, and the language lost a generation of speakers through death and emigration. Politically, the famine is a watershed. Irish attitudes toward British rule were irreversibly altered. Before the famine, many, like O'Connell, had believed in working within the Union for reform. After the famine, a new generation concluded that British governance had been lethally negligent or even hostile. Future Irish nationalists would point to the famine as evidence of colonial oppression. Organizations such as the Fenian Brotherhood were formed in the 1850s by Irish emigrants and survivors, dedicated to establishing an Irish republic by force if necessary. The memory of the famine fueled these movements. As one historian noted, the famine became a rallying cry. Its dead became martyrs that inspired later struggles. Even in British politics, the famine caused some rethinking. Debates ensued about how the government had failed. Many British officials, however, stuck to the narrative that the famine had been an inevitable, natural disaster, compounded by Irish overpopulation and backwardness. It was not until 1997 that a British Prime Minister formally acknowledged that the government of the 1840s failed their people by standing by as a crop failure turned into a massive tragedy. This quasi-apology resonated in Ireland, highlighting how even 150 years later, the famine's legacy in Anglo-Irish relations was significant. For the Irish diaspora, the famine was a defining moment as well. Those who emigrated to the United States, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere carried with them the searing memory of what they or their parents had endured. In cities like New York, Boston, and Toronto, Irish communities grew rapidly after the famine. By 1850, for instance, the Irish made up about a quarter of the population in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. These immigrants faced their own challenges: poverty, discrimination, the struggle to build new lives, but they maintained a strong sense of Irish identity and memory. Famine survivors in America commemorated anniversaries of Black 47, founded charitable societies, and remained keenly aware of how British policy had affected their fate. Irish Americans would later become a powerful voice advocating for Irish independence, often citing the famine as evidence against British rule. In Ireland itself, the famine is memorialized as a national tragedy. There are numerous famine memorials today, forlorn bronze sculptures of emaciated figures on Dublin's riverside. The haunting coffin ship sculpture in County Mayo with skeletal bodies entwined in a ship-esque rigging, plaques and monuments in villages bearing names of famine, dead, or emigrants. Folk memory enshrined certain locations like Skibbereen as emblematic of famine suffering. The famine also left a legacy in the landscape. In some rural areas, one can find the outlines of potato ridges still visible and abandoned. Fields grown over with grass since the 1840s, a silent testimony to the people who once tended them and then vanished. In summary, the Great Irish Famine of 1845 to 1852 was a catastrophic turning point. It was caused immediately by potato blight, but its unparalleled devastation was the result of political, social, and economic factors that compounded the natural disaster, or British policy failures. Delayed and insufficient relief, continued food exports, the ideology of laissez-faire, and actions by figures like Trevelyan and Russell greatly worsened the death toll. The experience of ordinary Irish people during those years was one of unimaginable hardship, a descent from a life of modest rural poverty into a hell of hunger, sickness, and exile. Entire communities were wiped out or scattered. The famine's legacy shaped Ireland's demographics, its relationship with Britain, and its diaspora's identity across the world. Even today, more than a century and a half later, the scars of the Great Hunger are remembered as a somber chapter in Irish history, a stark reminder of human vulnerability and the consequences of political indifference.